And I believe we're live. Hi, everyone. Welcome to For the Love of Comics and welcome to another Sunday live stream. Good to be back live after a couple of weeks of editing and roughly editing videos. And it's good to take a little bit more of a relaxed approach. Um, I hope my audio is coming. Hello, Jeevat Vahan. Good to see you in the chat. I hope my audio is coming through all right. I hope the video is fine. The picture is clear. The light is okay. These are all the kind of things that I like to check right at the top of the stream. Read it twice. Good to see you. Hope everyone had a nice Sunday. Likewise. So let me know in the chat, those of you who are present and voluble. Make sure you let me know if there's anything wrong. I am trying a couple of different things with the setup, as I try to do every single time I have a live stream or even with videos. So maybe I'll get into the technicalities of the different things, or maybe it doesn't need to be mentioned. Just let me know as long as the audio is correct. And is it synchronized? So does the visual and the audio link up? Jeemat Bahan says, all good. Ashwita is here in the chat for what moderation may be required, although it never really is. Although I shouldn't say that. There were a couple of times where we had some peculiar interlopers, but it's generally small scale and tiny live stream. Doesn't quite warrant the kind of nefarious attentions that maybe some others do from spammers and things like that. Super Laugh Hard, good to see you. Comic Binge, good to see that you made it. Glad to have you on here, sir. For those of you who do not know the Comic Binge, do check out his channel. It's a fantastic place, especially for those of you who are fans of Marvel and DC. The man is quite knowledgeable, and I've had the pleasure of being on his channel a couple of times now on live chats on. Well, the first one was our favorite Kurt Busiek comics, and the second most recent one was on three, I think we ended up with, correct me if I'm wrong, action scenes in comics that we really like. They were great times. I had a fantastic time. Good to see you here, Comic Binge. And glad to see everyone in the chat. There seems to be a number of people watching. And if you're watching later on, hello and welcome to this live stream. So we have over here Salvatore. Good to see you. Hello from Italy. Yes, most of the regular viewers know this already, but if you are in the chat and you like chatting, if you're watching and you like chatting, let us know where you're watching from. It always gives me a lot of pleasure to see all the different countries pop up, or cities even, where people are tuning in from. It is about 10:35 Sunday evening here in India, so Australia, it's a little late, so that's one of those things that I'm always. It's a little unfortunate. Singapore sometimes is able to make it. It's generally people more west of India who make the live stream, but I'm glad to have people from India, even though it's late for them. United States, Sunday morning. Somewhere in Europe, it's somewhere in the middle of the day. Ritvik from Kolkata, good to see you here. So, as we wait for a few more people to trickle in and as we get started, this is going to be, I don't know how long this live stream is going to be. We'll just sort of take it as it goes. I do have about 10 comics to talk about, but again, regular viewers will know that the number of comics sometimes has something to do with how long we run. But there's no guarantee it's going to be short if there are fewer comics. But there is a healthy number of comics over here to talk about, and there's quite a range in them. We've got American comics, we have European comics, but there is something else that unites all of them. And this is what brings me to the, sorry about that, this is what brings me to the loose theme of this episode of For the Love of Comics, this live episode. I had some weeks ago a video on a couple of new recent reads, and I booked them, or I presented them as 3 debuts. So I talked about Flake by Matthew Dooley, Mr. Invincible by Pascal Jousseline, and In by Will McPhail. And these are and I mentioned in that video that these are debuts or their first breakthrough works by these creators, but I do have more recent reads and I'll get to them in upcoming weeks. So this is sort of a continuation of that. Whereas those books, those comics were debuts, over here I have not just people, not just not debuts, not just second, third, fourth, maybe even longer comics by their creators, but old favorite creators, creators whose earlier works or earlier stories in the same series I have really enjoyed. They are some of my favorites, and these are more recent reads by these creators. Now, that is not to say that they're recent books. They may have come out. I'm trying to think some of them are quite old, some of them are relatively recent, some of them might be new editions, but they are new to me. So these are recent reads, but unlike those recent reads that were debuts by people who were introducing themselves to me through their works, these are works that I have been waiting for, that I have been anticipating because of my feelings about the writers and the artists behind these series. So that's the larger sort of thing. And we have a little bit more room here. I'm testing out the wide angle lens. I was always very nervous about this because that tight frame that I usually have in my videos, it keeps all the junk out of view. And so by spreading this out, there's just, you get to see more of this small little room in which I do all of my videos, whether they're live or recorded videos. You get to see a little bit more of the bookshelves. You don't see the upper level over there, and you don't see the full one over here, but you also don't get to see all of the cables and the wires and all of the junk that comes with this setup, which has been safely pushed to certain corners, making access to this room quite difficult. But at least where I am, I have a little bit more room. Larasa, good to see you from the UK. We've got Neil Crawford. We've got Will Holden, episode 2B. First stream, good to have you on board. Past 6 p.m. in Scotland. All right, good. So we've got hopefully a reasonable enough time for most people. Otherwise, if you're not able to make it, I hope you enjoy the recording. I have a comment. Tom says, thank you for making a video on Day Tripper. Yeah, Day Tripper is a fantastic comic, and I think it is a comic that really stands up to rereading. So irrespective of whether your first attempt at it or your first read of it was legal or not, I think it's completely worth buying and having on your shelves, even if it is from the point of view of lending it to somebody so that they can check it out. It's really something, I've talked about it often, of course, but yes, I'm glad you enjoyed that video, and I'm glad you enjoyed the comic. So how do we start? What was I talking about? Oh, yes. I was talking about the fact that I've got a little bit more room over here. I've cleared up this space, which means that I should be able to sort of move around the room, maybe even stand up and go places and come back to the table, which when I'm not switching cameras, which I'm not going to be doing today, may add a little bit more. And that also keeps this place from getting too crammed up, especially on days when I've got a lot to talk about. So I can, as I plan to later on, maybe step back to the shelves and grab something for a brief conversation. Well, enough vacillating. We've got a number of people on here. We've got a number of people in the chat. Hello, and let's get started. So, and those of you who've seen the thumbnail for this will have some sort of an idea, but what I'm going to do is, with these videos, it's always interesting to work out what sequence I'm going to go in or what order I'm going to go in, and it's completely arbitrary. So for today, I thought that maybe we can go from comics series to what are referred to as graphic novels, which are standalone one-volume reads. So I'm going to start with catching up on some series that I really enjoy. And of course, since I'm talking about series I really enjoy, it's inevitable that the chances are very high, I should say, maybe not inevitable, that I would talk about Usagi Yojimbo. So I've made a number of videos on Usagi Yojimbo. Usagi Yojimbo is definitely one of my favorite, if not my favorite comic of all time, and I've talked about why. And in previous live streams, I had started looking at the IDW series. So Usagi Yojimbo, over its, I guess, 40-year run now, has been published by a number of publishers. Albedo, right at the beginning, was published by, I think they were called Thoughts and Images, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. Then Albedo, the stories were published, Usagi Yojimbo stories were published in Critters, which was brought out by Fantagraphics. Usagi got his own series over at Fantagraphics. and then moved to Dark Horse for a tremendous multi-year run. Some years ago, Stan Sakai, who owns all of Usagi Yojimbo, moved to IDW from Dark Horse, and after some years there, he has now moved back to Dark Horse. So IDW is done publishing Usagi Yojimbo. And I had looked at the first two volumes, the trade paperbacks that were collected earlier, and I talked about Bunraku and Other Stories and Homecoming, which were volume 1 and volume 2 of the IDW new Usagi Yojimbo series done in color. Usagi Yojimbo has traditionally, outside of the Mirage 16 issue run and certain color specials, has always been a black and white comic. And so this is, since the days of Eastman and Laird publishing, or was it just Eastman? Kevin Eastman publishing Usagi in Mirage Comics in color. This is the first time the series proper has been in color for every issue. These two volumes were great. And one of the things that I had talked about at that point of time, or really brought back up again at that point of time, is how fantastic a series Usagi Yojimbo is and how easy it is to get into. Unlike many other comics and long-running series which can be intimidating to new readers, I think Usagi Yojimbo, I would safely say that I have never encountered any other comic that is as easy and as accessible for new readers to get into. So from that point of view, the 3 trade paperbacks that were left to collect the entirety of the IDW run. We don't get singles here in India, or even if we do, they're not that regular, they're not that affordable. So I am, as referred to in the comics community, a trade waiter. So here's volume 3, which is Tengu War, volume 4, Crossroads, and volume 5, The Green Dragon. So after the first 2, I think they went up to issue 15, or issue 14 actually. So there were 7 issues each in the first 2 volumes that I've already talked about. The third volume goes from issue 15, collects issues 15 through 21. This is issues 20, no, not this one, sorry. This one, Crossroads, is issues 20 through to 26 and 27 through 31. And 31 was the last IDW single before Usagi moved back to Dark Horse. Now, I just learned today that the first 5 issues of the Dark Horse miniseries are out as a trade, or it's been published, and I need to get my hands on that. So I'm not fully caught up with Usagi Yojimbo, because obviously I don't read the singles, but I'm not even, as of today, I realize I'm not even caught up on the trades. But I'm pretty close with these last 3 volumes, finishing off Usagi's chapter at IDW over 31 issues. And what can I say? It's Usagi Yojimbo. It's one of the most consistently excellent comics there is out there. Even a minor short story is better than so many other comics because of the incredible craft, because of the incredible consistency and the writing and the art of this series. And I've talked a lot about that, and I'm not going to get into all of those things over here. I will, however, say that the one thing I did want to keep checking is it still, say, from issue 15 of volume whatever this is, probably the 300th issue of this comic out there, is it still accessible to new readers? Could you pick up Tengu War and read Usagi Yojimbo for the first time, not knowing anything that has come before? And the answer for all 3 of these volumes is yes. Even in the middle of the stories, I would say, even if you read the first part of Tengu War, for example, and then, or you didn't read the first part and you started with issue 2 of that story, there is that sort of classical recap of what happened before. But what I did admire is that it doesn't recap it at the beginning of the story. The beginning of the stories usually end up being in media res, and you get the scene, you get the action, you jump straight into the action, and then later on you get a little bit of a recap when it suits the story. So for example, in one of these stories, there's almost a nested flashback, and Usagi thinks about what has happened, and these are stories that we may know of if we're longtime readers. but also fills in new readers with that sort of memory. But it's not just exposition, it's done during this long walk into a forest where there's time in the story for him to be reflecting and remembering things. It feels very natural. It doesn't feel like it's only for the reader, although we recognize that it is. And honestly, if there's one thing that I would want to say about these stories is that their artwork and their writing continues to be as exciting, as action packed, but also as clear and as simple, deceptively simple, as I'm fond of saying, as it has always been. I don't think that in these stories you're going to find much weakness. And I think by weakness, I mean, I want I wonder, wouldn't a comic like this show its age? Wouldn't it show at least a little bit of a tiredness, particularly because Usagi does follow a certain traveler on the road formula, which gives it an episodic feel, which gives it this classic, like you go from town to town, and then at the end of the story, even if the story takes a couple of issues, you sort of reset the status quo and you keep traveling and you keep having adventures. So it is obviously a format within which you could endlessly tell stories, as Stan Sakai has done over the last 4 decades. But this may be the only comic in which that kind of repetition still feels fresh and feels comforting, because you know you're in good hands. You know it's going to be a good story. Even when you see the end coming, it's not as if you saw through something the author was trying to hide from you. It's always the character moment that was more important, or the little detail that made this particular story different from something similar that you may have seen before. And it's that level of characterization, it's that attention to detail that gives Usagi Yojimbo, I mean, it's one of the things that gives Usagi Yojimbo its unique flavor. Now that I have finished the entire color run, I feel slightly snobby saying that I've always preferred the black and white, and I love black and white, and Usagi has been sort of a bastion of that independent black and white comic to a certain extent as well. But I do think that Sakai's art in these volumes is adapted to the fact that it's color. I think his line work is sometimes simpler and the spaces are larger, allowing the color to work in a way that I don't think it would just by coloring what were much more intricate or much more heavily lined works. Although, again, this is all relative. Stan Sakai has never been I'm trying to think of a very heavily detailed artist, Jim Lee, say, for example. He's never been that type of a line artist. It's always been very clean. But the colors over here are not offensive at all. I think it's quite well done. So, in spite of my sort of preference for the black and white at an aesthetic intellectual level, like just ideally I like black and white Usagi Yojimbo, I find nothing to complain about in these color stories. And I did wonder also if there would be a sort of movement towards even younger readers, because one thing that I think is interesting about Usagi Yojimbo, I keep saying one thing, I do mean another thing, is the fact that it's all ages in truly in a full sense of that word, of that term. It's not something for kids that an adult can sort of enjoy. It's something that is incredibly enjoyable by all ages. At the same time, it does have violence. It has a tremendous amount of violence. It doesn't have gore, and it has very little blood. You'll see some sort of monster wound, maybe, but it is violent. It's an incredible body count that this comic has, but being set in feudal Japan and being set in an extremely violent milieu where life was cheap and it could fall at the drop of a hat. Somebody gets insulted. It's kind of like that Wild West, and that's why Wild West stories and samurai stories have such overlaps and intersections. It's that sort of feeling of constant danger and threat that, in spite of it being bunny rabbits and now in color, it continues to have that edge. But I did wonder, would the IDW series feel more younger readers than the series that Dark Horse or Fantagraphics before had felt? And it doesn't. I think there are even more complexities. There are stories that have to do with adult themes, which I don't mean sex and violence, but marriages in trouble and betrayal and infidelity. We've obviously seen things like pregnancy and I don't want to get into spoilers for people who haven't read it, but family ties, etc. in Usagi Yojimbo. But I was impressed. It still, after all these years, manages to toe that line by being truly all ages, but giving you complex, but not overly complicated, simple but very deep and affecting stories. So, as far as these what would it be, 5 volumes, these 5 volumes that make up the Usagi Yojimbo run at IDW continue to be excellent comics, and I would heartily recommend them. Now, I know that with Usagi Yojimbo going back to Dark Horse, there are questions of whether we'll get more of the Usagi Yojimbo saga volumes, those compendium collections. And I'm not sure whether we will or not, what the right situation is, but I think it would still be 3 trades to a saga volume, the way they usually go, and maybe assorted short stories. So it would still take 2 saga volumes to cover these, unless, yeah, it would take 2. I would say you would put the first 2, which have 7 issues each, maybe with some crossovers, maybe with some spin-offs or one-shots, and then you would put these 3 together, which are 5 issues each. I did note that these trades got thinner after the first 2, and their price went up. So it's $20 a trade now, which seems to me like a little... but the printing and the manufacturing quality is excellent. So I think a hearty recommendation, especially, and the reason why I bought it is that I don't think I've got the patience to wait for the compendium, which may or may not come out. And although I don't think they're going to go out of print because it's Usagi Yojimbo and the rights are always, you never know. Because again, it's Usagi Yojimbo, and there have been times in the past where stories have been, and I'm not talking about specific editions, I'm fine with limited editions going out of print. I don't want the story to be not available at all. So I guess I was a little worried, and I realized that once Usagi has moved, I don't know what IDW is going to do with these stories, whether they'll keep them in print, whether they'll reprint them. So I did move a little panic to make sure that I was caught up. So I am now, except for the last Dark Horse 5-issue miniseries, I am now caught up with Usagi Yojimbo. Surprise, surprise, it continues to be excellent. It continues to be extremely worthwhile, and it continues to be a series that anyone can jump into almost anywhere. So if you're still on the fence or worried, I don't know. Have you not been watching my videos? All right, I'm going to take a little break now, take a sip of water, and check what's going on in the comments or if there is anything for me. People are chatting. Yes, good to see a whole bunch of people in here. Yes, so Usagi Yojimbo, Volume 1, Bunraku and Other Stories, Volume 2, Homecoming, Volume 3. Actually, they're not, I shouldn't be saying Volume 1, 2, and 3. That's what's confusing to people. Technically speaking, let me see if it's written on the back over here, but I will say that this would be volumes 33, 34, 35, something like that. So if you're counting from the very start. So the IDW run in color, trade paperbacks, 5 of them for the full run. Have not read nearly enough Usagi Yojimbo, 8-Big Loki says. We should correct that as soon as possible. There's plenty around, and as I was saying, and as I've always said, just get anything anything you found cheap, anything that's in a library, pick something up and see what you think of it, because I think it's a fantastic series. I don't know what else I need to keep saying about it. Is the creator still writing it or different creators? It's all Stan Sakai, written by Stan Sakai, drawn by Stan Sakai. There are some covers that are by other artists, and I think they're variant covers. I saw some covers that are collaborations between Stan Sakai, but the interior, all written, all art, and lettered by Stan Sakai. The colorists are different. But yes, for 40 years, that's part of what gives it that great consistency. Part of what it shares with things like Love and Rockets is it's the same creators who've been doing it all this while. For someone getting into Usagi, would you recommend color or black and white? Whichever one appeals to you more. If you don't have a problem with black and white, go with black and white. I think Usagi Yojimbo, I would say the first volume and the earliest stories are not indicative of the greatness that it reaches, but it's also something that gets better very, very fast. And it's not like the first stories are not that good, but if you can get your hands on the special edition, the 2-volume slipcase edition from Fantagraphics, which I think is reprinted and easily available now, that contains the entire earlier stories, and then the Dark Horse stories start with volume 1 of the Usagi Yojimbo saga. So either the special edition or volume 1 of the saga are great starting places, or just pick up whatever you want. But I personally do love black and white Usagi. Let's see. Anything else that I need to get to urgently? All right, nothing. I don't. If you have a question for me, do at me so it stands out. My eyes are getting worse. And have I read Dragon Ball? No, I have not read Dragon Ball. That's one of the big gaps, but I think I was sort of prejudiced against it by the TV show Dragon Ball Z, which a number of people I knew watched, and I was sort of forced to watch it alongside them, and I didn't enjoy it. But that may not be representative of what I hear is a very epic and influential comic. Gore Vidal is talking about Monica Bellucci and Natalie Portman. Of course, what else is new? Kolkata Book Nerd says, what is a good entry point? Dark Horse reprinted volumes enough? Yes, I would say they're enough. Absolutely. You can skip all of the Fantagraphics if you want to. The thing that appeals to me, though, is when you get to meet all of the characters for the first time, and then later they become recurring characters. So when you read it later, you just fall straight into the fabric of things. But if you're one of those people who wants to see how things came to be, how people first met each other and things like that, in a series that is mainly about one guy, but has quite an extensive cast of colorful characters who are all very interesting, I think... And this is, you know what, this is a larger question also, and I think this will segue very well into our next comic, is that I honestly think that sometimes we, and I firmly include myself in this group, sometimes we make too much of a deal of reading from the very beginning and reading chronologically. I mean, and I understand why, but when I think back to when I was a kid, and I think back to when I first started loving comics, and even at various times in my life when I've omnivorously read comics and been completely into them, and they've captured my imagination, very seldom was I reading them in order. Very often they would be random. Of course, there were comics that were just completely standalone, and a lot of the Indian comics that I read were stories that were completely contained in one issue, maybe even multiple stories, but fairy tales, folk tales, biographies, science comics, things like that, good for you comics. But many things were just out of, you just read a random issue of the X-Men, you just read a random issue of Superman, and there was just enough to give you a sense of the world, and you could enjoy that story. I know that people have said that that's not the way they're written anymore, etc., but that really has been the appeal, and I don't think we give ourselves enough credit as readers for our imagination creating things. And then later, you can go back and read old stuff and you can slot it in. You can create your chronology. So I think holding off on things and waiting to read from the beginning and not finding something appealing right at the beginning, which happens with many series, and therefore not reading further is a shame. And if someone just read from the middle and read something that had evolved and gotten good, and that's where they wanted to start from, I think it's absolutely fine. In fact, then you can go backwards once that love has been deeply rooted into you, and then you can go read early stuff that wasn't so great, and you can take a much more forgiving view of it and say, look how they were learning, and look at how they were forming, and things like that. So I honestly think read anything in any order, in whichever way it gives you pleasure, and let's not focus too much on chronology, even though I understand why we do. okay, you read whatever you can get your hands on. Yes, and I still like being that way, and I think there is something about my shelves that also irritates people sometimes when they'll see volume 1 and volume 4 and volume 7 and nothing in between. I'm like, well, those are the ones I found. And I read them and I enjoyed them. And if I ever find the ones in the middle, I will. But am I not going to read? And this is the same thing that happened with Cinebooks and Thorgal. Is I wanted to read from the very beginning. I did find volume 1 of the Cinebooks edition. I read it, and then I didn't read any more Thorgal for the next couple of years because I couldn't find volume 2. And when I said, screw it, I'm just going to get whatever I want and read it, I'll put the chronology. I can do that and enjoy what I have available to me rather than waiting for this phantom day in which I can get to volume 2, by which time I probably would have forgotten everything about volume 1 as well. But speaking about chronology, sorry, someone had made. Oh, Aris had made a point saying kids are more tolerant with reading a book without knowing the background. Adults are less tolerant. Yes, I think that's true. But but my thing is why? Why is a kid more tolerant? Just because they're enjoying the act of reading. They're enjoying being in that world. They're not. It's not like a kid doesn't want answers. They do want answers, but they're willing to discover the answers and work out the answers and swallow it and then figure it out later. Whereas adults do seem like, no, I'm not taking another step unless you tell me exactly what's going on. And that part of it, I don't know. I think sometimes it can be more damaging. But I don't want to get on a soapbox here. I do think, though, is that reading is better than not reading. Reading from the middle, just reading something to try something out is completely fine. And then someone might say, oh, no, you can't read from the middle. You've got to read from the very beginning. And I'll guide you. I'll tell you when you have to do that. But in my the vast, I'm suddenly looking at my shelves to see what's going to catch my eye, but they're all single volume reads over here. But in my experience, it's not as necessary. Let's just put it that way. It's not as necessary as sometimes we make it out to be. Great. All right. So now the next comic I want to talk about is a French comic called Donjon. Or Donjon, and here's where I get to do my new thing. Actually, I didn't want to bring these out here, but they're right here. These are the English versions and the editions of Donjon by Joann Sfar and Louis Trondheim, who are doing this series. But Joann Sfar and Louis Trondheim are also involved in other comics, which also include a lot of other French writers and artists. But I encountered Donjon, I don't know, quite a long time ago, maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little less, published in the English editions, translated English editions by NBM. And I've got a number of NBM comics, but they're not necessarily as well known a comics publisher, although those of us in the know, we know. But NBM has a remarkable library of comics, and it does seem to be a little difficult sometimes to get some of their books because their books aren't in print very often. And this definitely happened with Donjon, because I read volume 1 of something called Donjon Zenith Dark Heart, and this is an RPG Dungeons and Dragons type of spoof. It's quite funny, but it's also violent. It's quite dramatic. It's got wonderful, colorful art. And if you have seen the comics of Louis Trondheim and or Joann Sfar, this will be familiar looking to you, but it's also great to see them tackle wizards and goblins, monsters of all kinds, barbarian hordes, princesses, and of course the lead duck hero, kind of hapless guy. All in all, a very enjoyable, sarcastic, spoofy, but also strangely silly and slapstick adventure comic. And for lack of a better phrase, I would say it's one of those things that some people would describe as a very European comic. It's difficult for me to think about this combination of cartoony goodness and violence and drastic things happening and people behaving not so, these are not, there's no lessons to be learned over here. There's no good and bad in a very clear cut sense, which is part of what makes it so entertaining. But it's also, I mean, sometimes there are very very broad jokes and very broad humor, and then immediately followed by violence of also a very broad and humorous nature at times, which makes for, at least for me, a fantastic mix. But the thing that, again, not the thing, one of the things that makes Dungeon so interesting is the way that Joann Sfar, Louis Trondheim have thought about this series or this continuity. So you have this adventure of this idiot fellow coming to this magical, mysterious dungeon, hearing about the treasures that are contained within, and wanting to explore it the way that many of these heroes in these stories do, and his adventures of encountering this in the dungeon, and that continues in volume 2, The Barbarian Princess. And then, many years after I had read volume 1, I was able to finally get my hands on volume 3 back in style. But Dungeon Zenith is one series. You can think of this as the main series. So the main series is Zenith. You also have, by Joann Sfar and Louis Trondheim, Dungeon Twilight, that takes place like 80 years later from Zenith, from the events of Zenith. So volume 1, 2, and 3 are chronological at the story of these characters in this situation. But volume 1 of Dungeon Twilight takes place in the future, in the far future of the dungeon. And there you have volume 1, Dungeon Twilight, volume 1, Dragon Cemetery, volume 2, Armageddon, volume 3, The New Centurions, and volume 4, The End of the Dungeon. So these 4 books were not published after these 3 books. I think, and I'm not sure about this, but it went like volume 1 came out of this, volume 2 came out of this, then volume 1 came out of sometime in the future, then volume 2 came out of sometime in the future. And that was not enough. So you've got these 3 volumes of Dungeon Zenith, then you've got these 4 volumes of Dungeon Twilight in the future and the fall of the dungeon, and then you have Christoph Blaine joining Joann Sfar and Louis Trondheim for Dungeon The Early Years. So we know of this wizard who in the main Zenith series is the wizard who owns the dungeon, or is the master, the current master of the dungeon. The early years starts with how he came to the dungeon and how he came to find the dungeon and take control of it. So the early years, volume 1, the early years, volume 2, and so on. So you see that the chronology of this story has been by Louis Trondheim. And of course, you have people like Kara Soet, the husband-wife couple, whose comics I have talked about on this channel as well, on Dungeon Twilight. You've got other stars of writing and art coming in there, but you've got 3 distinct timelines, all of which are in publishing overlapping with each other. And this has been seen as each of these timelines can have 99 volumes or something like that in the introduction. So Trondheim and Sfar see this as a true sort of never-ending story in which you're looking at the present being Zenith, the future being Twilight, and the early years in the past. You're looking at them at the same time. You're getting pieces of the future. And this makes for a really wonderful experience. I found myself quite moved at times by seeing what characters who I was following in one timeline had become or what had become of them. There was a real pathos that associated itself with this. And then you come back to this story because the next volume is published later and you've got this bittersweet sort of taste in it. But you also see triumphs on things that people are failing on here. And then you realize that that thing did come to pass eventually, but in a very different way at a very different time. It's a fantastic experience. And the world of Donjon isn't just limited to this, because you also have, from Joann Sfar, Louis Trondheim, and Manu Larsenet, you have Parade. And Parade is the storyline that takes place between Zenith and Twilight. So this is interstitial. And then you have Donjon Monsters, which are all separate collections of various creatures that you encounter in these other stories, but given their special spotlight, sometimes as origin stories, sometimes as standalone. And you'll see that even more superstars of comics help join and contribute to these issues. So as a storytelling project, as a publishing project, this is amazing. It's astonishing. I love the idea, but what I really love is the way it's executed. It isn't incredibly consistent, particularly because you may have different people pulling art duty, so the look will change and the tone may be affected depending on which period of time you're in or which story you're in. As I said, that there is a sort of I wouldn't call it whiplash, but there is movement from very dark and very dramatic to very funny and very slapstick, even within a single page. And the pathos and the characters are complicated, and they do and say things to each other that aren't your normal fairy tale storytelling tropes. At the same time, that kind of spoofing of the RPG or the spoofing of the high fantasy things is not cheap and easy jokes, which are quite common, I would say. They are more to do about they have more to do with storytelling, and they have more to do with characters, and the fact that these characters, in spite of their cartoony appearance, behave with such flaws, I thought was delightful. But the puzzle of reading these stories in these different ways is what I really enjoyed. And so over the years, little by little, hunting for various issues, like for example, Monsters. I only have volume 4 and volume 5. I have I don't have the first 3, and I think there might even be more Monsters volumes. I don't have any of those. But I was thinking about these one day and I started wondering, hey, I wonder if there were ever any more issues of Donjon published. Because I stopped, as far as the Zenith storyline is concerned, is that volume 3, Back in Style, was the last one I'd heard of. So I wonder, is there a volume 4 out there? So I went online and I looked and I saw that there was a volume 4 out there. I ordered it and it arrived. And this is what it looked like. And it says volume 4. It's Joann Sfar, Louis Trondheim. It's from NBM, but it seems to have gotten bigger. So they've started publishing these in the full, what I'm guessing is the European album size or close enough to it, which means that now the comic looks like this. And look, I know there is this whole approach of like, bigger is always better, and I don't necessarily think that, and I do really like these, but once I saw this, I was like, hold on, why did they do this in the middle of the series? Why didn't they start with this? But of course, this was more than 10 years ago. So it's a curious sensation I felt, because I was very happy and I wouldn't say very, but I was happy and irritated at the same time, because now I've got volume 4 and it doesn't come this way. But the story continues and I get to read more Donjon. So I was very happy and I realized that there's a volume 5. So I found volume 5 as well. So NBM is continuing with Donjon, has brought out volumes 4 and 5 of Zenith, which take that main storyline forward, and I can only hope and imagine that they're going to do the same with Twilight, and they're going to do the same with the early years, and maybe with Monsters. And when I was looking at that, I realized that what I was thinking of as a volume 1 and volume 2 pack that was being sold, and I'd seen that on Amazon, and it was just it was a good price. It was a decent price, and it said volume 1 and volume 2, and it showed this cover, and I realized that that wasn't a 2 pack. It was a different book. And what I realized it was is this volume 1 and volume 2 put together in a full size. So they've reprinted volume 1 and volume 2. So of course I had to pick it up now. So this is a double dip that I ended up doing in spite of having 1 and 2, because now they are here in this full size. So it's probably foolish of me, and it's foolish of me at many levels, but I love this size actually. It looks wonderful. Look, this is the page we were just looking at the smaller album. And there are a number of dungeon stories out there, I agree, but they've got their own chronology. You can just read one of those. And NBM has now reprinted volumes 1 and 2. It has volume 4 and 5 out here in this format, which means that volume 3 should be coming, which means that for all of you, this should be the perfect time to try out Dungeon. In fact, you can try out Dungeon, the first 2 volumes in one volume right here. You can try out the first 2 volumes of Twilight in this size as well as the first 2 volumes of the early years. So this actually makes for a perfect starter in which you get either 1, 2, or all 3 of these 2-in-1 editions at the full album size, and see if you like this. I mean, I really enjoy it. I can see why it wouldn't be for everyone, but then from 4 and 5 onwards, and I'm guessing since 1 and 2 are out and 4 is a separate thing, volume 3 will be a separate thing. So I'm guessing that they've got this sort of introductory pack availability of this particular edition. Am I slightly irritated at the fact that all of these are going to be made redundant by this? Not really, because I am a double dipper, notoriously some might say, triple dipper, quadruple dipper. It depends. I mean, if you see how many bone editions I have, or how many different editions of, that's not the point. The point is that I like having these albums in this format as well. There's something very cozy, and there's this nostalgia attached to them because of the way I discovered them and how a lot of the other books that I've read are this way. But when I think about books that are shrunken down, I don't like the shrunken down Tintins. I don't like the shrunken down Asterixes. I love David B's Epileptic, but ever since I saw what Epileptic looks like in French, I find that this smaller size is somehow, it's less satisfying. So there is that part of it. So I am slightly irritated, but I will say that the pleasure of reading, and this is a series I know that I like, so that's a different thing as well. The pleasure of reading them in this size and seeing the art and the colors at this size means that I'm going to go after volume 3, etc. But what I really like is the fact that NBM is continuing the series. So the fact that 4 and 5 are out in this form means I can keep reading the series, and I'm glad to see that this series in English hasn't died the way that Last Man, the comic that I was discussing over on the Comic Binges channel, sort of died from first second, where they brought out 6 or 7 volumes and then stopped printing it in the middle. And that has been brought back by Robert Kirkman's Skybound, and I think that one's a larger size than the original sort of manga type of size as well. So I'm glad to see that this series is being continued by NBM, even though there seems to be a long hiatus, or maybe the hiatus wasn't that long and that's just how I felt. So here, I realize that I talked only a little bit about Dungeon, but I think that's kind of it's kind of a situation that some of you might commiserate with me on. The one that I found myself. A pleasant surprise, but a little bit of a pinch as well. Let's get to the comments and check before I move on. Kolkata Book Nerd says he loved Love by Frederick Grimaud, Age of Reptiles by Ricardo Delgado. They're not confined by any language, makes them universal. something similar. Something similar, as in, there are lots of fantastic silent comics. I think the most easy one to recommend is The Arrival by Sean Tan, which is something that I've put on my top 10 gateway comics as well. It's truly universal in many, many different ways, the way that silent comics are. And of course, the comics of Thomas Ott, whom I've also talked about, are largely silent. And there are many, many more, and I'm sure people in the comments can give that as well. But if you're thinking about something more nature oriented and animal oriented, let me think about that and get back to you. Donjon is so much fun, David L says. It absolutely is. I really enjoy it. I think it you just have to sort of go into it and not have previous expectations of what you want from it. A difference between a collector and a reader, just wants to check out the comic. Sure, yes, absolutely. I want to read something interesting, and if it catches my attention, then I'll find some more of it. And in general, and I think all the people in the chat or people watching this channel might feel the same way, is we're not going to run out of great things to read. That is one of the most wonderful things there is. There will always be good things to read. So if you read something and then you can't continue with it, that's fine. Read something else. At least you got to experience that. You can file that away, or you can always absorb something from it. I think the collector part of it is important to some of us, and is a thing that we embrace in different ways. I don't want to make it about collectors versus readers, but yes, I do think that collector part of it, for me at least, as I've spoken on this channel, it comes second. It comes as an accidental thing of being a sort of voracious reader, and you end up with a collection because you just bought stuff you wanted to read. Are you familiar with the Phoenix comic from here? It is the go-to comic for kids that adults love. No, I do not know about Phoenix, but I'll have to look that up. Couldn't get into Love and Rockets, decided to give it one more try. Yeah, give it a try. I mean, as I say, it's not for everyone, and there are obviously things, but I do think that there are unusual things out there that are just superbly done. And if we take a little time, sometimes what will happen is that superbness will find its way to hit us, even if the trappings or the dressing of it does not appeal to us right at the beginning. It's that thing about good art. And I don't mean art as in drawing, I just mean art. That's the thing about art, is that it can kind of get across barriers, and it can be universal in a particular way. And I think that Love and Rockets is a good example of that, where it is weird and strange and odd and maybe not relatable at the first glance. Although for me, for example, the Gilbert Hernandez stories, from the very beginning, I was hooked. They felt very literary, and they felt familiar, but also fresh in a comics format. Jaime's stories took me a while to get into, but I'm glad you're giving them another shot. Funny to see Donjon in paperback. Oh, now I'm going to start thinking about Donjon in this size in hardcover. That'll be the next edition that I want. No, I think it's going to stay. In paperback as far as NBM is concerned. All right. Every edition of Judge Dredd's America. Yeah, see, we've got some books like that where we love having different editions of things. So I do have multiple editions of books. I mean, I used to have multiple editions of books just because I found a book that I really loved very cheap. And I was like, I can't believe that's $1. I'm going to have to get it, even though I already have it, because it's $1. Luckily, I avoid those things now. I like to say that, oh, that's a hardcover, I don't, have one, or that's black and white, or it doesn't have to be a fancier edition. It can just be an edition that I think makes the reading experience a little different. And because I am already a fan of the story, I can now focus on the difference between those two things. Those are the kind of things that I try to highlight in my edition comparison videos as well. Yeah, there was a place where every version of comic was just shown so one could compare. Well, yes, I think, that's one of the things from the early days of YouTube. I thought that, early days of my YouTube, I thought, oh, I'd like to put something out there, not because people are clamoring to see it, but almost as a thing that if someone searches for it, they could find it. That's the way I wanted to show the difference between bone and black and white and color, for example. But you can't do that for every single page. You can't do that for every single moment. And of course, reading is still a very different experience. The approximation of putting it on video is a good one, but it's never going to be a real replacement for that reading experience being affected. And I think even things like size, of reading something in this size and reading something in the larger size, I can show you how much bigger a page is, but the way your eye moves across and the way you absorb that story at different sizes is not, I think, going to be communicated. It's only going to be indicated or hinted at. All right, so moving along, and that's a pretty good clip. So we are done with Usagi Yojimbo, we're done with Donjon. So those are two long series. Now let's shift into things that are sort of halfway between series and graphic novels. In fact, the next one I'd like to talk about is Friday. And this says book 1, the first day of Christmas. There is a book 2 that's out already, and there is a book 3 planned. So it's going to be 3 volumes, and each of these, this is a very slim volume, as well as a very small sized volume from Image. This is just a little bigger. No, in fact, it's the same height as the Donjon editions and a little smaller. I'm not sure what this format is called, but if I was to compare it to, say, a regular trade, you can see that, you know, there's a size difference, but I don't mind it. It feels fun to hold. I like this size. It also has a slight school exercise book feel to it in the size, and that helps because of the story. So all in all, it's a nice little package. But Friday is written by Ed Brubaker and drawn by Marcos Martin. Marcos Martin, the only art from Marcos Martin I've seen is in Brian K. Vaughan's, his work with Brian K. Vaughan on The Private Eye, which I thought was fantastic artwork. And I know that he's done some other stuff, but I don't think I've read anything else other than that until Friday. And Ed Brubaker, of course, is Ed Brubaker. I am a fan of Ed Brubaker's, but, and here's where I hope I don't make too many enemies. I'm a fan of Ed Brubaker's, and he's been incredibly consistent, and particularly, I think, with his collaborations with Sean Phillips. I'm a big fan of Criminal. I loved Fatal. I've read. I was trying to remember which other one. Pulp was very good. I quite enjoyed Pulp, actually. Bad Weekend, but the Criminal Universe stories. But I will say that I find Brubaker to be very reliable. And that's not a bad thing, particularly when I was talking about Usagi Yojimbo and I was thinking about this. I'm like, there's something similar, but where with Usagi Yojimbo, that reliability creates a sort of comfort because it's an adventure comic. I think with Brubaker's a particular version of hard-boiled crime and a certain weariness and a certain, it's been polished to an extent where I find it very hard to find rough edges on it. It doesn't mean that everything is something that I absolutely love, but the dependability of it has, to me, made me, like, when there's a new Brubaker book out, I don't immediately jump at it and say I have to read it. It's not to say that I know it'll be good and I know that I'll be entertained, but I won't be absolutely entertained by the feel of something new and fresh. And that's something that perhaps only I think, because there are a lot of people, who say that he's just getting better and better with every book that he's putting out. And it's just, this one is even better than the other. And while I completely understand and agree with the evaluation of his skill, I don't necessarily find that to be doing anything in leaps and bounds, or even doing anything with so much variation that I find myself surprised. Having said all that, that kind of changed with Friday, which I will have to say is one of the most enjoyable Ed Brubaker books that I've read in a long, long time. And that's not to say I have not been enjoying those other books that I've read. This one, I really enjoyed. I was surprised by it. I do think that, of course, Marcos Martin's art has a lot to do with it. And I'll give you a couple of looks. It's a very interesting, I wouldn't say unusual, but it's an arresting art style. The colors by, I think, Munsta Vicente are perfectly matched to this art style, and the artwork is dynamic and fluid, expressive in a way that absolutely worked for me. But the story that Ed Brubaker and Marcos Martin tell over here is what got me. Is I wouldn't want to say Stranger Things because it's got nothing to do with that kind of supernatural level, or Paper Girls. There's something about young people investigating crimes, but this is, I think, closer to the Nancy Drew, or not even the Nancy Drew, the sort of five find outers or the three investigators, where you have some precocious kids. You have one particularly misunderstood kid and another kid who stands up for them, and they're best friends. It's sort of formula we've seen before in children's adventure, and especially children's detective crime kind of things, in which these kids figure out what's going on in their town. Now, Friday is built on that as a foundation, but with these kids older. However, not older like 30, 40 years. This is just like first year of college or first semester as a freshman, that age. And the history that they have is something that they had in school. So the return of the main character, the girl we see in these pictures here, she's coming back to her hometown from college, and she is kind of trepidatious about meeting up with this boy who's her best friend, and they used to be whiz kid investigators when they were in school, but then them becoming adults and her leaving for college, and a romantic but not quite romantic sort of kiss that happens between them, and the awkwardness that happens after that. It's been the gap while she's been gone. So this entire story is first drenched as a sort of teen drama, angst, and not knowing as you're growing up what your childhood friendships are, but against the backdrop of these kids and their investigations, and this, her best friend, the boy in the story, being someone who is very odd, very weird and unrelatable to by other people, but she feels she knows him, and she knows that they have a connection. And his avoidance of talking about all of this, and instead focusing on this thing where he's saying there's something that needs to be investigated, and her thinking this is just his way of not wanting to talk about the real thing until it's proven that he is right and there is something weird going on, is a fantastic story. Now, I'll show you a little bit more of the art to say that it does have dimensions to it. It does have narrative breadth. But what I loved about this story was it taking this Nancy Drew Twin Peaks approach to teen angst or teen romance, but it's not classifiable as romance. And it's not yet, at least in the first one, it's not outright a crime and violence story, although there's definitely hints of it. It's hard for me to describe more without getting into spoilers, but as I was saying, this felt like a breath of fresh air from Ed Brubaker. This writing was, the dialogue was funny and snappy, and that's something I expect from him. But somewhere I was thinking he's become this weary old man who likes to write weary old men. And he does such a good job of writing these people beaten down by life and having that one last shot, or maybe redemption will come and maybe it won't. And this has been this for him to tackle young characters and to put that kind of zing and energy as well as the depth and pathos into their relationships. And this is just 3 issues, mind you. So in these 3 issues, it did its job of sinking its its hooks into me. It got me well. So even though I am a little curious as to why they're publishing them 3 issues at a time, and I think ever since I've quit my job, I've become a lot more conscious about how much all of these comics cost. I'm like, that's $20, that's $15. But of course, I try to get them on sale and things like that. But penny pinching aside, this is a great comic. I'm very excited and happy to see this coming from Ed Brubaker, and I'm really looking forward to Volume 2 and Volume 3 of Friday. This is Book 1, the first day of Christmas, and I'm pretty sure that Book 2 is out already. Martin and Brubaker, yes, it's a great combination, and it's a fantastic comic. But yes, I was trying to see if someone had was digital first from Syndicate Panel. Yes, like Universe, like The Private Eye. So I I don't read online, and I guess I should try and take a look, because if this is the stuff that's being published over there. But again, I'm glad that Panel Syndicate. Sorry, not I must have reversed that. Panel Syndicate. I'm glad that they do bring out print versions of those comics that are published over there, because I only know these two, but I've heard a lot of good stuff about Universe, which is another one that I've been looking to get. But based on The Private Eye and what I've heard about Universe, and especially Friday, going to look forward to it. I don't want any spoilers. La 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 la. I'm not looking at the screen. Don't put any spoilers. I know you're not. I'm just joking. Right, Friday. His art, Marcos Martin's art. Yes. If you haven't, check out The Private Eye, which is the only other Marcos Martin I've read, and I thought his art over there was fantastic as well. James says, retailer here, I always promote it as what if Nancy Drew said. Yes, exactly. But it's more than just Nancy Drew, because it's got that collaborative aspect. It's like Harriet the Spy. But I'm trying to think of which comic, or not comic, which children's adventure stories had like the partners, like almost like a Holmes and Watson, in which one was more sensible and one was uh, not a very socially adept person. And there's something in my brain that I can't just put my finger on. But if that is something you like, and if you like Ed Brubaker and Marcos Martin, I mean, it's a no-brainer. But I think even for people who might be a little wary, I would say I was delightfully surprised by Friday. And it, as I said, it felt zingy and fresh and energetic, and at the same time I did get the emotion of it. And the fact that it did it in 3 issues, to the extent that it did, and the suspense that it created, the tension that it created, was terrific. Edward's moving, so all his comics are packed up. Hardy Boys, yes. But yeah, the Hardy Boys were a little plain, I guess. It's because of that sort of syndicate-oriented writing, right? It was the Stratemeyer Syndicate that put the Hardy Boys out. I was thinking maybe the 3 Investigators, or the Alfred Hitchcock books, or the 5 Find Outers. No, that's a little too base. I can't remember which one it was, but it was. But it's but Friday is very, very unique. Both of the characters, the boy and the girl, are quite memorable, and the dynamic that they have between them, the fact that it is a sour dynamic in some ways, and you're remembering nostalgically a time that isn't that far away. It's all wonderfully complex, but it's not done with density, as you can see. It's just it's got a wonderfully light touch and great presentation, but it hits harder and runs deeper. Tiff and Tondu, maybe, I don't know. I don't think so. I haven't read that. Next up, we have Cheshire Crossing. So Friday is definitely going to be 9 issues, I think. So Cheshire Crossing is something that is a standalone read in this volume, but is something that leaves off in a way that could very easily have a continuation. I'm not at all sure if this is planned as a series, but as a single book, you don't need it to be a series. And I think somewhere it would be interesting, because even though the very last panel could maybe be interpreted by some people as a cliffhanger, I don't think it has to be a cliffhanger. I think it can just be, that's all the story you get over here, and imagine the rest for yourself, which is the way I think a lot of stories used to be. Like, not everything had 3, 4, 5 parts. And I think stories end at certain times and lives continue, and not all story goes up to death. So therefore, you could do some imagining. But again, before getting on the soapbox, why did I pick up Cheshire Crossing? One, I found it on sale, and that always intrigues me because I'm more liable to try something out if the price is a little lower. But actually, it was the artist Sarah Anderson. The name Andy Weir sounded familiar to me, but I don't remember any comics written by Andy Weir. And then I looked at the blurb and I realized that Andy Weir is the novelist who wrote The Martian. Now, I haven't read the book The Martian, but I've heard that the book is very good, and I've heard that the movie, which I have watched and I thought had a good screenplay by Drew Goddard, I think. I heard that the movie cuts out a lot of what made the book very interesting, or cuts out a lot of brainy science stuff and funny stuff. But I thought the movie was very smart and very funny as well. So by proxy, I have a good opinion of the book, the way people have talked about it. And I did not know that Andy Weir did comics, and he doesn't. So in the introduction of this, he writes about how he wanted to make this comic a long time ago, but he realized that he couldn't draw and he wasn't learning fast enough, or he couldn't draw well and he wasn't learning fast enough. So he abandoned that and he wrote prose and he wrote The Martian. And now this has come back with Sarah Anderson illustrating. Sarah Anderson obviously is the artist behind Sarah Scribbles, a series of things that have now been memeified and shared online. I see them all over the place, but these fantastic, lovely, funny cartoons about everyday life, relationships, and having a very you've probably seen Sarah Scribbles, but I also really enjoyed her like mini graphic novelette, if you could call it that, Fangs, which showed a completely different art style from the almost stick figure Sarah Scribbles art style. And I I enjoyed that werewolf vampire love story. I thought it was well written and well drawn, and I was I was surprised by the range, and then I realized, like I have done on several occasions before, that just because someone draws a particular way or draws a strip a particular way doesn't mean that's the only way they can draw. That just means that that's the way that strip needs to be drawn. And this was another reminder of that. And now, looking at this, I feel that this is another sort of jump and leap from that art. So that the fact that this is by the same artist as Sarah Scribbles and Fangs, to me, is surprising because of the way it looks. It's lovely art, and the coloring in it is also wonderful. But Cheshire Crossing is about an institution which brings together Dorothy, Alice, and Wendy, and because of the adventures that they had in Oz, Wonderland, and Neverland. I forgot where Wendy went. In Oz, Wonderland, and Neverland, respectively. And that's a sort of dimension crossing or portal hopping. And so these three have been brought together because of their stories, and they're orphans or abandoned by their families. And you get a little bit of why. And it's their adventure. And I have to admit that the first time I heard of that, I thought of Lost Girls, which is Alan Moore's X-rated exploration of pornography using those three characters from literature and a couple of others. But this is very much a young adults, or I wouldn't say it's a young readers, but it's a young adult comic. Nothing X-rated about it. And the fact is that even though I have seen these three characters put together, I was wondering how derivative, or how, like now once you read Fables and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and you've seen all of these things, how much more can you see of literary character mashup? And what was surprising to me was how entertaining this was. It was very well written, and that definitely helps. The characters were very distinct from each other. They weren't just three, like Wendy as a tomboy and Alice as a real brat. The way that they bounce off of each other was great. And Wendy's got this a little bit more maternal, but she's also a trained pirate, so she's got a different approach. But Alice, I think, was my favorite, and I think over there right there. That's her. She's just so angry and sassy, and she's completely independent, and she doesn't want anyone's help, and everyone else is a little bit more willing to see what is going on, and they've been through a lot of crap, so they're happy that someone's taking care of them and feeding them. But Alice is not going to have any of that, and she's got this adventure because of uh, being transported into Oz and then back into Wonderland. So it's really dimension hopping, this story. They go from one world to another using different techniques. It's not the slippers, as they find out. So of course, if you know The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan, um, you'll understand that, okay, there's that kind of reference. But this is really its own story, and it's very different from something like Fables or something like Lost Girls. It's not really interested in being some sort of a dissection or a deconstruction of those stories. It's very much taking these three characters as if they have superpowers or they're special for some reason and doing a brand new story using the characters, of course, that you already know. I thought this was great. I was surprised because I was like, okay, I'm going to read it for the art and see how, but it's probably going to be for kids and it's probably going to be a girl power story. And it definitely is a girl power story, but not in an obnoxious way at all. The art is a lot of fun to go through. But once again, it's the interaction between the characters, whether it's the witches that they meet or the kind of way they talk to each other. It's got a little bit of a classic fairy tale language, but most of it is quite contemporary, which adds to that energy and that sass. So, yeah. Lost Girls notwithstanding, Fables notwithstanding, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and things like that notwithstanding, Cheshire Crossing, I thought, still did a good job of establishing its own identity. And maybe it's because I didn't expect that much. That's one of the reasons why. So Andy Weir is definitely a good writer. I'm not sure if this is a full example of his things, but his dialogue definitely crackles, and his ability to create an identity with dialogue was something that impressed me. And the art over here, as I said, was gorgeous, I thought. So another thumbs up from me on Cheshire Crossing, written by Andy Weir, drawn by Sarah Anderson. Yeah, and all ages Lost Girls. The fairy tale multiverse, yes, it does have that multiverse hopping aspect to it, except that I think of the multiverse as being parallel versions of the same world. So we're seeing Earth in different ways, whereas these are just completely different. Oz is a different land, Neverland is a different land, and Wonderland is a different land. They're different dimensions. So yeah, parallel dimensions, but not versions of our dimension. But I mean, you get it, you know what it is. All right. Next up, what do we got? Snagglepuss. This is probably something everyone here would have read already before me. This is written by Mark Russell with art by Mike Feehan. Now, Mark Russell is someone who came to my notice of, I think, like with many other people. The first thing I read of his was the Flintstones, and I don't know, he must have done other stuff before that, but the Flintstones comic that he did really really blew my mind. I was not expecting that at all. It was one of my favorite reads of that year, and I continue to think about it because it did such a fantastic job of putting social satire and commentary next to just lovable characters and emotional beats, and on top of all of that, it linked up to the Flintstones, the TV show, very well. When I read Afterlife with Archie, I could tell this is someone who had really understood and studied Archie, and that's the way I felt when I read the Flintstones. Is I thought this is someone who has seen the Flintstones over and over again, but has now taken all of these elements and said, what does this mean and what does this stand for? And that texture was sort of cherry on the top of that sundae, which I thought was a very well written book. It was very well drawn. The situations in it were very funny until they became very emotional. But I was very impressed by how much Flintstones lore and symbols, iconography were used in that comic, which is why I didn't read Snagglepuss Chronicles over. This is something very similar to that because Snagglepuss is also a Hanna-Barbera animated character, and this is Mark Russell taking on that one, where this character is represented as a famous playwright. In Tennessee Williams, I think, is the playwright that Snagglepuss is based on in this story. But I stayed away from this because I had never watched any Snagglepuss. I'd never seen that. I'd never even heard of it. Now, I was not a Hanna-Barbera scholar, but I watched some. So, I mean, I know most of them, but Snagglepuss is not one that I knew of. So I thought that, well, I probably, if I think about, like, of course I would enjoy the Flintstones even if I'd never watched the Flintstones, but so much of that comic came from the Flintstones itself that I was just like, I don't know if this is going to be. And then someone was telling me about that it's about like, it's like court hearings about, similar to the McCarthy's court hearings, but it's also going to be about prosecuting or villainizing somebody because they're gay. And this is why you shouldn't like listen to people or get even the slightest bit of spoilers, because it automatically created for me in my head something that was going to be quite loud, that was going to be quite preachy. It was going to have a very distinct polemic, because whereas the Flintstones were about a number of things, any issue could be about anything. One could be about unions and labor, another thing, but this one was not going to be that scattered from my impression of it. So I stayed away from it, being unfamiliar with the source material and thinking that what it wants to be about or what it's going to comment on, unlike the Flintstones, is going to be much more singular and individual. Like it's going to be one thing. I'm not going to say that I was wrong about that, because it is a little bit more focused. It's for sure more focused than the Flintstones, but that doesn't mean that it's only about that one thing, about those kind of hearings and the kind of social vilification. But it did not matter that I had not read, that I had not watched the cartoon. It didn't matter because I was able to understand what it was. And to some extent, what it reminded me of, only to a certain extent, was a particular Astro City story in which a cartoon lion, loony lion, comes out and enters the real world. And maybe that was in my brain before, where I thought that was what was going on over here, but that's not it. This one, this Snagglepuss is firmly entrenched in our world. I think the way you can look at it is like the animated show BoJack Horseman, where you have anthropomorphic animals and human beings right next to each other, and it's recognizing them as anthropomorphic animals. And there is a lot of history in this. The more history you're familiar with as far as the US history at that time. But for example, that's Marilyn Monroe over there. And you've got Marilyn Monroe related shenanigans over here with, I think, Arthur Miller and Joe DiMaggio. But that part of the art, I think that's the only thing. The fact that that didn't look like Marilyn Monroe to me, that made it a little odd when you saw people that you were obviously supposed to recognize. And over here, for example, he tells an actor that he's not going to make it in this, but he can be a star, but he's not going to be an actor. And why doesn't he try speaking like Marilyn Monroe? And of course, that's Clint Eastwood. But it took me a little bit of a stretch, and I've seen Clint Eastwood quite a lot. So it took me a little while to get that into my head as Clint Eastwood. It took me a little while to get that into my head as Marilyn Monroe. And it doesn't matter to me how characters are drawn, but if they're supposed to look like people, or they're supposed to be people whose appearance is very familiar to us, I think there it does create a little bit of a disruption. But I would say that's the only critique or criticism I have of this is that mismatch of that art, because the rest of the story and the way that it integrates the comics, the cartoons into the reality of this, and particularly those loud, not loud, but the courtroom sequences, or the questioning and the interrogation, the way that the bad guys go after him, it it could very easily have been extremely melodramatic, and it is melodramatic. There are characters who do things and behave in ways that are against their true nature because of the way of the world, and this is something that is, again, not something that we are unfamiliar with, but it ended up being an emotional story. It ended up getting through. But I also think that the wit and the cleverness of the writing uh, helped it a lot. I don't think that we should. I think Mark Russell is someone I'm very interested in, and even after the Flintstones, I sought out a couple of comics by him. I think there was a Swamp Thing short story that was in the sorry in the collection, the DC collection of Swamp Thing short stories that came out. That was probably my favorite story in that collection. And now I have a couple more of his books lined up, because everything I've read from him indicates that he's a very smart writer. There's one place here where he's talking to the Senate committee or something, and they say, well, insulting us is insulting every single American citizen. And his response is, I didn't realize I was being so efficient. It's that kind of stuff that I really liked about this. I like that wit, and I like the fact that in the back of the book, in the back of the trade, you've got a historical index, or what is it, a glossary, a history glossary, in which they talk about all of the real, yeah. So the historical glossary for Exit Stage Left is all of the real incidents and all of the historical truths that this comic has incorporated into it, including characters. So Snagglepuss is sort of based on Tennessee Williams. Huckleberry Hound is sort of based on William Faulkner. The Stonewall Inn was a real restaurant. The HUAC, etc., etc. So, I mean, that stuff makes it makes you understand that sometimes the most ridiculous thing in something is something that really happened. And that's where that's where comics based in history can get their power, to say, you thought I was making that stuff up to give you an entertaining story, but that is the truth, and we made up that rather comparatively boring thing, as opposed to that. So I think the Snagglepuss Chronicles, I wouldn't say I loved it as much as I love the Flintstones, but the Flintstones was really something like that took me completely by surprise and bowled me over so much that I did go into this, even though I was trepidatious, I did go into this thinking, yeah, this is a smart writer. This is a good, clever writer. So, but it was very good, and it surprised me because it also showed me how wrong my preconceived notions can be, and how odd and incorrect a thing I can build up if I only rely on one or two snatches of information. So I'm glad that I eventually got to it, even though it's been out for many years now. And I'm glad that it's still in print and available from DC. Not everything always remains in print and available, which allowed me to get to it at this time, even though it's many years later. And I'll definitely be checking out more Mark Russell. Actually, I have checked out more Mark Russell. I read Superman Space Age, which I really liked, but I'll talk about that in more detail in a different video. Analog Comics, as always, coming, like an hour and a half after the stream starts and asking us to rewind, which we will do so right now. So Analog Comics, again, another great channel over here in our chat. Do check out his channel for some excellent spotlights on European comics. I'm learning a lot, and one day we're going to have a conversation about European comics, Cinebooks. Yeah, I talked about Cinebooks, Analog Comics. You might want to rewind and tell me what you think of that. Moving on. What do we have left? All right, so Snagglepuss Chronicles, so as I was saying, Friday, definitely we're getting more parts. Cheshire Crossing, is open to more parts. I think you could definitely have more stories. You might even say that no, it definitely ends on a cliffhanger. The Snagglepuss Chronicles is done. So this was, I guess, a mini series, and therefore, and it includes a special in here, which is not essential. So it's 6 issues, mini series, and it's done as a story. Now we're moving on to the things that are more single volume graphic novel like Snagglepuss. And the first one I have over here is Accidental Czar by Andrew S. Weiss, drawn by Brian Box Brown, The Life and Lies of Vladimir Putin. Now, obviously, anyone who knows this channel would be able to guess that I picked this book up because it's written, well, not because it's written, but it's because it's drawn by Brian Box Brown. And this is the first book I know of, and I have almost, I think I have all of Box Brown's books. This is the first one of his that is drawn by him in his trademark style, but not written by him. And also, it was a biography of Putin, and I was interested. Now, I don't usually spend a lot of time on this channel talking about books that I didn't enjoy that much. And I won't say that I didn't enjoy anything in this book. There's plenty, especially Box Brown's way of depicting moments and situations in which things come to a head and people either deal with them or collapse in front of them, is still great. But I could tell that this wasn't written by Box Brown, and I did not like the writing of it. And by writing, I don't mean the text and the dialogue. It seemed very slipshod. It seemed very cobbled together. I think Box Brown's art does a great job of giving it integrity, of getting it from one situation to another and keeping things clear. But I fear that this is the author, Andrew S. Weiss, is someone very highly placed, or was highly placed in the government, and was in the room when certain calls happened and when certain things happened. And they make it a point to point out that they were in the room, but it's too diffuse. It's not what I want from a biography. I end up with no insight on Vladimir Putin at all. It seems a bit like a hatchet job, but it's not vicious enough to be a hatchet job. It's got more self-importance and a little bit of automatic dismissiveness, which I didn't quite understand. I mean, I suppose I understand where this idea that, all right, everyone's already on this page, everyone's already of this opinion. But when I read a biography, and particularly a biography that says the life and lies of Vladimir Putin, I'm expecting some sort of maybe an expose. I want to know things that are not commonly known, and I want more than facts. I want some sort of insight to telling me how somebody works or what makes them tick, or at least have some guesses at it. I found that while Accidental Czar did make a couple of attempts at that, it in no way. And it's a shame because it's Box Brown. Box Brown has written some of the best biographies. He's right there. If only Andrew S. Weiss, I think in my head, would have taken more advice from Box Brown, because Box Brown's biographies of Andy Kaufman and of Andre the Giant, his book Tetris, his book Cannabis, are fantastic books. I've got a video on Box Brown in which I talk about 4 or 5 of his books, and then I do have another video in which I talk about his last book, which was his first book of fiction, Child Star. But I'm going to get everything that Box Brown puts out, but I was disappointed by this, and I don't think that Box Brown should work with other people who aren't as good of a writer as he is. And this one, I don't know. It seems like a politician or someone. I don't want to be too disparaging, but as a story and as a comic that promises me the lies, I don't I can't remember a single lie that this book has. It's just like, oh, he was deceptive and he did this, and then it's too summarized. It's too, as I said, it's too slipshod. It just wants us to automatically take the author's word for something, and the author is supposed to be demonstrating this to us. So because it didn't clarify anything for me, I would have to unfortunately classify Accidental Czar as a disappointment. But Box Brown is not only not to be blamed, but here is the proof that he knows how to tell a great nonfiction story. And the He-Man effect, how American toy makers sold you your childhood, particularly because there was already that Netflix documentary, The Toys That Made Us. It might seem like a redundant thing to have, but this is not what that documentary was at all. Although it treads a lot of the same ground, this is less interested in the business aspects of that toy making. From that, like the documentary was like, how did this get made, and how did this idea come to them, and how did they get this design, and what eventually led to the downfall of it. I am a fan of He-Man because I was a fan of He-Man when I was young. I wouldn't say that I am a fan of He-Man now, but I'm never going to get rid of that nostalgia. But the He-Man effect is about a time when advertising to children and what form that advertising took and how insidious it could be and how deep that programming could run without any protection or without anyone thinking there was anything wrong with that. This is about the He-Man effect. And that's why this story isn't only about Mattel or only about Masters of the Universe or the He-Man toys. It's about representing a certain time in which the policing of these things, the legislation around these things, and even the understanding of what effects these kind of presentations have on children's brains were understood mainly by advertisers, and they were able to get a grip on things before others realized what was going on. Box Brown does a fantastic job of quickly giving you a sense of the world around and the contexts, which would have to do with politics, which would have to do with the economy, which would have to do with people and television. It's fantastic, and it's a little sad. I mean, it's more than a little sad, and I think that's the point. There are many writers, I would say. There are many people who wish to be polemical, and I understand that. They have a strong urge to teach or to illuminate, and sometimes, or unfortunately very often, it loses some audience when it tries to be too preachy, and I don't even know what that means, as in too preachy. If there's something horrible and you want to spotlight something horrible, it seems almost cheap to say that, well, make it entertaining, just the truth cannot be enough. So that's not what I mean. There's something that Box Brown does, is you can feel his anger, the author's anger, or you can feel his outrage, but he's able to give it to you through facts and position, and then just one slight line of commentary, not heavy-handed at all, not trying to drive the point home, but really highlight it. And this is what I have been trying to figure out a way of expressing of why I love Box Brown this much. I spent all that time in that video, and I still, as usual, thought that, maybe I didn't do such a great job. The He-Man effect is a great example of Box Brown's skill at taking something and putting it across in a way that you can read through this very fast. You can go through it as if you're eating potato chips or French fries or something. But it's also nutritious. It's also getting in your head. It gets in your heart, and I loved it. And I think particularly after the disappointment of Accidental Czar, it did make me breathe a sigh of relief to say that, all right, you know what? I mean, if that's a work for hire, or someone got in touch with Box Brown saying that we need you to work on someone's on someone else's project, etc. I'm glad that he's getting to do those kind of projects as well. But this is what I want to see from him, and this is what I want to see from people who want to write this kind of nonfiction, the one that isn't as dense and as packed in as, say, something like Joe Sacco may present to you, but something that nevertheless gets to the point being planted inside you, the reader. It gets the point across and it gets it clarified. And I thought The He-Man Effect was a fantastic book, very worthy of being right next to Cannabis, which I also think was a great work at making me realize how cannabis legislation has always been racist and how the approach to cannabis, as opposed to, say, the approach to alcohol, was very much along the lines of class and race, things that were obvious to me after I'd read the book, but I hadn't, shamefully perhaps, thought of before. And it's that kind of making you think twice, or making you question, or making you think in a different way about something that you thought you were familiar with, that the He-Man Effect does so well. So Accidental Czar, not so much, unless you just want to be a completionist as far as Box Brown stuff is concerned. The He-Man Effect, essential reading, in my opinion. All right, how are we doing on time? Not yet at 2 hours. It's nothing. And I'm almost done. So I think maybe this might even make it to the 2-hour part of it. Dax Halo says, I recently finished the He-Man Effect. It pretty much ruined my childhood. Oh, retroactively ruined your childhood. I could see that. The good thing about my childhood, let me tell you about my childhood. The good thing is that I was never caught up in the buying of the toys at a particular point of time, because they weren't available at a certain point of time, and when they did become available, they weren't like like when Mattel came to India, and these toys became available. They weren't as slick and as polished as those sort of foreign toys that you had kind of caught a glimpse of because someone had brought one back from another country. But also, they weren't as appealing to me as the He-Man comics were. And I, made it a point to watch the He-Man cartoon show. So the fact that there wasn't like the steady machine of putting the latest toy out there and the latest accessory, as a child, I was able to mainly circumvent that. There were still toys, and I had a couple of action figures, but the kind of thing that's talked about in the He-Man Effect, that whole manufacturing and the way that the factories and the advertising and the TV stations and the affiliates and the legal things were lined up in such a perfect storm, those are things that I don't think ever happened in India, and I also don't think that the effect was that impactful, at least for me. So I kind of got away. But Paltrack says, I feel that's kind of what Star Wars is. I mean, yeah, I can see it. I mean, see, as adults, I think it's a different thing. I think what the He-Man Effect is really interested in is children. And if you say that I'm an adult and I'm a grown up and I can make my own decisions, sure, it makes sense. Apparently you've had time to bake your noodle and get to that level, and you are, yes, an adult. When you're not an adult, I think the level of exploitation and the level of programming and the understanding of, and these are things like how do we don't know much about how the brain works at 20, 40, 30 years ago. We knew even less. So I think some of these things can only in hindsight be understood, but that mechanism or that machinery or that absolute lack of any kind of, I don't know, circumspection, I suppose, are the larger questions works like this bring up. Stephen Fairweather says, thank you for getting me back into Usagi Yojimbo. It's my pleasure. Love to send me a comic. Yes, absolutely. I always love receiving comics. Email me at ftlocomics@gmail.com and we can chat. Analog Comic asks, maybe the Putin book was too much on demand, made for the current situation. I wonder. But see, it was neither this nor that. I'm not. It was sort of wishy washy. I'm trying to figure out because I don't read. It was published in 2022, so copyright 2022 at least. Yeah. So maybe I think it's obvious that the author is the author because of who they were in the government and what role they played, and also the kind of expertise they have from that point of view. And that's not to say, I think he may have even written prose books and articles, etc. It's just that as a comic and as a biography, as a narrative story that gave me insight, it just didn't do anything. And I don't know if what you're saying, analog comics, is true. If it's on demand, I don't know who it's for. I don't know what it's then doing. Is it? It's not gossipy enough, and when it tries to be gossipy, it's not as clever and as tongue in cheek the way that Box Brown is when he writes about Andre the Giant and he gives you this one little incident, or he writes about Andy Kaufman and he talks about that one afternoon by the pool. I mean, it's so memorable, it sticks in my head, and he gets across that character and he's able to find that moment that represents that character. So whether or not you like pro wrestling, you know Andre the Giant, and that's the thing that this book absolutely fails to deliver on in any way. All right, moving on to our final two books of the evening. We have, returning to For the Love of Comics, Chris Gooch with In Utero. Chris Gooch is an Australian comics writer and artist who I discovered some years ago when I read Bottled, which was a graphic novel, Deep Breaths, which was a collection of short stories, and Under Earth, which was the new book of his that were coming out. And that's how I found out about him. And there were already two books out. So he was published by Top Shelf. Those three books were published by Top Shelf Comics, as is In Utero. And Top Shelf Comics, I love them. They're one of my favorite comics publishers. And I have a live stream in which I talk about 36 different Top Shelf comics, essentially saying, hey, what do I have on my shelves? And that I'm, live streams right here, this is about as big as most live streams get for me. It's like people watch it here, but they don't watch recordings of it later, except if it's Tintin. But that live stream has gotten more than average views later on. So I guess people liked it. Again, it's me just rambling about a whole bunch of books, but check that out because I do mention Chris Gooch in that one, of course, as well. But Top Shelf Comics seems to be putting the Australian invasion out there. And Pat Grant's Blue and then The Grot are also two comics I've talked about, and Campbell White's Home Time I talked about, along with Superman Smashes the Clan in my video on great all ages comics. And Home Time, The Grot, Blue, and Chris Gooch's Under Earth were all fantastic comics, and I am very intrigued by what's going on with Australian comics, because I also got some mini comics. Oh yes, Glom Press sent me those fantastic risographed mini comics that I talked about in a video. And there's another comic that I read recently that I'll talk about in another one, but I read the first issue of Godzilla Skate or Die, which was also great. So I'm already sold on most Australian comics. There seems to be something in the storytelling style, at least of these authors that I've encountered, that is very evocative of place, very evocative of time, but also feels timeless and contemporary at the same time. The books by Chris Gooch that I have read are difficult to classify because he does seem to be quite adept at a number of genres, but without being simply photocopying what has come in the genre before that, putting his own touch on it, which is a touch of melancholy and a touch of slice of life, almost realistic observation, even though the story might have large science fiction trappings, or horror or existential dread and a sort of internal expression. And in Utero is no different. This is going to be difficult to talk about without spoilers, and I really don't want to spoil it because it's not about the plot points being spoiled, it's about seeing where the story unfolds. I will say that it is it is beautifully drawn in a very recognizable. Hold on, I'm trying to get that focus to work. Is it working? There we go. It's beautiful art. It's got this duotone, but the duotone switches. So sometimes it's blue and white, and sometimes it is red and white. And of course, our red and black and blue and black. But it's also very tied into the mood and the tone, as well as the location. So the color coding of this, it's not obscure, but it is relevant and it is intentional. And that's all I'm going to show you from this, because this is kind of a horror story, but a very unique internal horror story. At the same time, it's an extremely tense story that gets its tension from a very slow burn. Here's some early pages in which this girl is being dropped off at sort of a daycare, although she insists she's too old for daycare and she should just go with her mother to the office. And this daycare is set up in this old abandoned mall. And these 2 pages of her walking off from her mom, not saying I love you, and then the mall itself is, I thought was fantastic, very evocative. And I don't think I've ever been in an old abandoned mall with graffiti all over the place, but I immediately felt I knew this place. I immediately could feel its largeness and its emptiness. I could feel its sort of desolation, and I was hooked. The earlier stories by Chris Gooch I had read were, some of them felt like short stories by Raymond Carver, like the Robert Altman movie Shortcuts, things like modern, family, urban, and what's underneath the surface, what we express, what we don't. Quite literary, but quite realistically tied into things. His short stories had these incredible pieces of horror, but that horror would just be a single image, or it would just be there's someone at home and they're wondering what's in the garden and they're just checking the window over and over again for a couple of pages, and it would create this tension. So it's not really about being attacked or even what is outside that window. It's just that back and forth, and you come to it and you go away and you come back and there's something else there. And the stories didn't have the most traditional sort of closure where they still felt like they completed something. Under Earth, which was the book that I talked about, was a fantastic, like, sort of prison story, which almost ended with an anticlimax that seemed perfectly suited to what that story ended up being about. And they are so difficult to talk about because they're so unique. And I think In Utero is the same way, and in many ways it's even more accomplished. Chris Gooch seems to have gotten more polished, gotten more ambitious, and he's pulling off a lot of clever tricks, but he's also giving us a slow burn over here that drip feeds us information and drip feeds us situational context, but our tension comes from being worried about the well-being of the characters. And that's what I thought was the great thing about it, because that's really what the core of anything, whether you're writing an intellectual horror or a slasher horror, there's going to be one part of it is, do I want to see somebody get hurt, or do I want to see someone not get hurt? I guess that's kind of a bifurcation, and there might be some sort of a voyeuristic thrill we get of watching horrible teens get murdered and the nice teenager escape the serial killer. I don't know, I don't want to get into the psyche of that, but this one is about being very concerned for the safety of the characters that we're reading about and we're following. And it did a great job of creating both a sense of comfort and a sense of menace at the same time. In fact, there are sequences in which the central character is becoming more untrusting and we're with her, and then when she becomes more trusting, we're with her. So we go in the complete opposite direction, and instead of saying, hold on, don't give up your trust, we're like, no, we get it, we understand, you're getting comfort from this, that makes complete sense. And then we get tense again. It's that roller coaster of being safe and then not being safe in a very limited space and in a very limited time as far as the story's time is concerned, but lots of pages. And that's what, I keep using the term slow burn, but that's really what, to me, Chris Gooch is so good at doing in all of his stories. Is like, there's no rush to get somewhere. Everything is given to you at the time that it needs to be, and it's the way that it's parceled out to you that makes you revel in the storytelling, whether it's the tension, whether it's the triumph. So I would really recommend In Utero for people who don't have to have, like, I was going to say, who don't have to have an explosion on every page, but of course, In Utero starts with an explosion on the second page. So actually, it has that too. But that's Chris Gooch's In Utero. Do check out Chris Gooch if you haven't already. So that's 4 books from Top Shelf Comics out right now. Yes, The Land Down Under. I have a mini playlist on my channel called The Australian Invasion, because I just put those Australian comics because, again, the Blue and the Grot by Pat Grant. They have their own video, and Campbell White has one, and Chris Gooch has one, and then there's this. And that brings us finally to our last book of this evening at 12:26 a.m. I'm 4 minutes away from a 2-hour thing, but that's okay. I don't need to watch the clock that much. This is A Guest in the House by Emily Carroll. This has been out for a while now. I think it may have come out last year, and people may already have been talking about it, deservedly so, because this is a fantastic book. Emily Carroll is someone I really love. Every comic of hers I've read, I have thought very highly of, particularly Through the Woods, which I've talked about in one of my earliest videos, which was the top 10 gateway comics. Again, what did I mention in my top 10 gateway comics earlier? No, I've forgotten. Anyway, Emily Carroll's Through the Woods was a haunting collection of kind of spooky ghost stories set in a very Brothers Grimm, Hans Christian Andersen, but with a modern take, but with artwork and lettering. And it was a collection of short stories, but the artwork and the lettering was very different in story to story, but also had a similarity that sort of tied them together. A Guest in the House is a graphic novel, so it's not a collection of short stories. And this is art like I've not seen from Emily Carroll before, where it feels a lot more comicsy. It feels like comics panels, drawings, etc. Whereas a lot of the other one felt like paintings, felt like watercolors and multimedia sort of being put together, maybe even cutouts. However, this also has this art, because there are two, or I would say, two distinct art styles in this book. One, which is the exterior and the everyday story that we're getting, and the other one, the interior or the dreams, the fantasies, the imagination of the character as a child, as an adult, knights, dragons. Just this is what a lot of the previous book, Through the Woods, sorry. This is what a lot of Through the Woods would have looked like, with the writing and the lettering in the middle of the art and across the page in that way. Whereas over here, it's used to represent a particular kind of narration, a particular kind of interiority expression, as well as you've got things like this. Like, it's almost like an illustrated book. If you look at this, it's mirrored over. If you look at this page, for example, you've got typography of different sizes and styles coming on the page. It's almost like an illustrated book or Shel Silverstein. I was asking some people if Shel Silverstein has comics or not. But this is also a horror story. It's a spooky story. It's a creepy story. I don't know. Again, not wanting to spoil things, so I'm going to show you things from earlier. But it's very solid comics. It's extremely fun and clean and clear to read, but you feel that dread creeping up on you. And just like I was saying, how In Utero seems to be growing, evolving, Chris Gooch getting more out of his style and getting more confident, as fantastic. And I will always, until my dying day, I will say that Through the Woods is a fantastic comic, one of the greatest. This seems like a real maturation of taking those individual sort of scary stories and that individual little moments in mood and music, but adding layers to that, having things in it. And honestly, if I was to think about all of the stuff that we have talked about today, and which is probably true for much of what I really enjoy, what I really like about all of these works, Usagi Yojimbo and Utero, Snagglepuss and Donjon and Friday, is the layering. Is like no one thing is, it's not just this, and it's not just this and this. It's 2-3 different things. The way you have a teen drama and romantic angst and detective stories and horror and small town supernatural stuff in Friday, the way you have things that I don't want to get too into in Utero that have to do with parenting and children, that have to do with demons and monsters in Usagi Yojimbo. These are things that we can say, themes and motifs, etc., but it's just like the complication of the story. And A Guest in the House is a good example of that, where the layers that are over here of this woman in a marriage to a man older than her with a child from a previous marriage. It combines things that have to do with domesticity and frailty. It feels at times like the Yellow Wallpaper or Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, but it's not just that. And I don't mean it from the plot sense. I mean it from the kind of way that some good horror stories, like the way that movie Hereditary had a lot more going on than just being a ghost story. It was about things. And then those are the kind of horror stories I think that really work for some people, is where the horror is a metaphor. It's a manifestation of several other things. And it's not a very direct one-to-one correlation. And this is probably one of the more complex and the more layered horror stories I've read in a while. In fact, even calling it a horror, you know what? I don't mind calling things. I don't mind calling A Guest in the House a horror story. I wouldn't mind calling In Utero a horror story. It doesn't mean that they've got to make you jump. It doesn't mean that they've got to contain violence. It doesn't mean it's got to have gore. It means that it really creates a sense of horror. It creates a sense of, even if it's a creeping sensation of dread, that tension, if it's coming from something that is not quite natural, if it's coming from something that's not quite labelable or identifiable, I would consider that horror. The horror of the unknown, of what's under the bed, what's in the dark, what's under the water, like if you're in a small boat and it's just a dark ocean. Those kind of things are about that unknown aspect of things, and what lurks in that is been very fertile ground for lots of writers and artists over the years. I think Guest in the House and In Utero, but Guest in the House in particular, is a fantastic addition to that. It's very unique, but it's very cognizant of the stuff that has come before it and around it. It's very modern in many ways, especially when it looks at family and when it looks at psychology, when it looks at damage and when it looks at personalities and how they work off of each other in neighborhood, in marriage in between parents and children, between step parents and stepchildren, but bringing it all together in a way that was truly satisfying, without cheating, without, pulling the rug out from under your feet at the last minute as a cheap trick, while still creating a heck of a payoff and a culmination that makes you want to read the book almost immediately after you finish it, which is probably one of the higher compliments that we can give to many things, is that it's a big book. It's dense, but it's not dense in the fact that you're not taking a long time to go through a page because there's so much in it. It's because you want to find more stuff in it. The drawing and the art is, I think, perfect for how it wants you to read it. That whole question of how the reader's speed and how the reader's involvement is actually orchestrated by the author is perfectly given over here. And it's got a lot of those small little things in which it'll establish one thing for you earlier, and then a few pages later it'll bring it back in just that shivery sort of way that sends that electric vibration down the back of your neck. It's that kind of stuff that Emily Carroll is almost like a poet of. So if you enjoyed her comics online, in the ones in Through the Woods, I think most of them you can find them on her website online. If you enjoyed Through the Woods, you will definitely like A Guest in the House. But even if you've never read any Emily Carroll before, it's it's one of those things where, don't think about it as far as plot is concerned. Think about it as far as the mood is concerned. Think about it as far as the characters is concerned. And there's no way that you won't be creeped out at least once or twice, if not more. Fantastic read. One that I will be returning to very soon, I think. A Guest in the House by Emily Carroll. I finally got to read it. And that is it. I think that I have made my way through all of these books, so I'll just give a quick recap, and if there are any questions or anything that you'd like me to get to before I sign off, let me know. So, in this video, we looked at A Guest in the House, written and drawn by Emily Carroll. In Utero, written and drawn by Chris Gooch. The Snagglepuss Chronicles, written by Mark Russell and drawn by Mike Feehan. Mike Feehan is a person whose work I haven't seen before. Cheshire Crossing, written by Andy Weir. Is it focused? Yeah, Cheshire Crossing, written by Andy Weir and drawn by Sarah Anderson. Friday, written by Ed Brubaker and drawn by Marcos Martin. Donjon by Joann Sfar, Louis Trondheim, and a whole bunch of people. Alfred, Mazan, Karasoet, of course, Obayon, Blaine, Manu Larsenet, and Joann. I don't know what the last name Joann is for, but Donjon, no longer in these small volumes or these small editions only. Donjon from NBM now being reprinted in English in full album size. How wonderful. And of course, the evergreen, the perennial Usagi Yojimbo. Great. Jeremy says, I've added a guest to my cart. The Red Spine books on the bottom of the shelf. Which series is that? Red Spine books, where is this? Are you talking about the Love and Rockets box set over there? That's the first 50 from Fantagraphics. Facsimile hot covers, which will be coming up. And that's you can't see it. That's on that armchair over there. That's all my Love and Rockets comics for the research for my next video, which is continuing, but because my last one had such a positive reaction and I got the impression that there are a lot of people waiting for the next one. Now I have to make it accurate because I realized that I was just going to talk very loosely about stuff, but now I've got to say which issue is in which volume without messing it up. So it's going to take me just a little while longer. But if those were the books you're talking about, that's what it is. Reddit, thank you very much for the kind words. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Dex, Dax Haller says you could call them books. Yes, yes. I probably took all the horror out of that boo with my delivery of that. Analog Comics, try out Emily Carroll, or take it out of your TBR pile. That's what this is all about. It's about like the stuff is not on the TBR anymore. I'm not going to buy books until I've read books, is what I decided. So now that I've read books, I can get back to buying them. See if Volume 3 is out for the double dip on that. I'm glad everyone was here, everyone who could join us. Thank you so much for joining. Have a good night, have a good day, have a good rest of the Sunday, rest of the weekend, whatever is left. This has been For the Love of Comics, and I'll see you at the next video. Bye.